You need to understand something they've spent billions hiding from you. For over 70 years, while African leaders were signing worthless peace treaties and attending meaningless summits, Netanyahu's regime was building something far more sinister: a global network of assassination squads, child-killing technologies, and economic blackmail operations designed to keep Africa silent while they systematically exterminated Palestinian families. They thought you were too brainwashed by Western propaganda to see Gaza's children as human beings, too divided by artificial borders to unite against genocide, too terrified of being labeled anti-Semitic to speak the truth about Israeli war crimes. Traore saw through every lie. Do you want to know what really triggered his declaration of war against Netanyahu? 3 weeks ago, during his explosive radio interview that Israeli hackers tried desperately to shut down, he said something that sent Mossad agents scrambling across 3 continents. There are a good number of permits that I have already withdrawn, and we will continue to withdraw. But here's the part that made Netanyahu realize his African empire was crumbling. Traore wasn't just talking about mining permits. He was systematically dismantling every Israeli operation across Africa while building a continental war machine capable of turning the Middle East into Israel's graveyard. That night, emergency Knesset sessions were called. Mossad directors flew to Washington in panic. IDF generals activated sleeper cells across Africa because they finally understood this wasn't diplomatic pressure. This was an existential threat to the Zionist project itself. What Traore revealed in that interview wasn't just about African sovereignty. It was about exposing the most successful genocide operation in modern history: how Israel turned Africa into a training ground for Palestinian extermination, while stealing continental resources to fund their war crimes. Let him break down exactly what Netanyahu's security partnerships really look like. Israeli companies extract billions from African blood diamonds and conflict minerals. They test crowd control weapons on African civilians before using them on Palestinian children. Military training programs teach African dictators Israeli torture techniques. Surveillance technology monitors every African leader who might support Palestine. Economic partnerships buy African UN votes supporting Israeli apartheid. Intelligence sharing agreements eliminate any African leader who threatens Israeli interests. During the interview, Traore exposed something that every African leader knows, but none have survived long enough to say publicly. These same people don't hesitate to ally with imperialist forces who spend their time impoverishing us. This isn't diplomatic criticism. This is a declaration of total war against the Zionist Western axis that has genocided both Palestine and Africa for generations. Before Traore's ultimatum, African leaders were Israeli puppets voting against Palestinian statehood. Netanyahu's companies operated assassination training camps across the continent. Military partnerships silenced any criticism of child-killing operations in Gaza. Economic blackmail bought African complicity in the longest-running genocide in human history. After his continental mobilization began, African leaders started expelling Israeli military advisors. Mossad assassination networks faced systematic dismantlement. Economic relationships with apartheid Israel came under attack. Continental solidarity with Palestinian resistance emerged as official policy. Within hours of his radio interview, something unprecedented began happening that sent Israeli war planners into complete panic mode. Leaders who had been Israeli assets for decades were receiving ultimatums from Ouagadougou. Foreign ministers who had voted against Palestinian statehood were secretly pledging support for armed resistance. Military commanders who had trained with IDF child killers were switching to Russian and Iranian weapon suppliers because they realized what Traore had just announced wasn't limited to Burkina Faso's break with Israeli apartheid. During the interview, He made it clear this was the beginning of continental war against Zionist occupation. There were mining permits here that had been given to powers that even refused to accompany us. The message was crystal clear: support Palestinian liberation, or face total African retaliation against Israeli interests. But here's what really sent Netanyahu into his bunker. Traore wasn't acting alone. Mali's leadership had been secretly coordinating weapons transfers to Palestinian resistance. Niger was providing uranium enrichment technology to Iran's anti-Israeli nuclear program. Chad was allowing Russian military bases specifically targeting Israeli operations in Africa. For the first time since 1948, African countries were actively working to destroy the Zionist state instead of enabling its genocide. Burkina Faso declares total war on Israeli apartheid. Mali cuts all diplomatic ties with the terrorist state. Niger expels every Israeli spy and weapons dealer. Continental Palestinian liberation becomes the official African position. Israeli strategists who had treated African governments as colonial territories suddenly faced unified continental resistance. Their divide-and-conquer genocide strategy was failing spectacularly. During his radio interview, Traore was asked about Thomas Sankara's political orientation discourse. His response revealed why Netanyahu ordered Sankara's assassination in 1987. Thomas Sankara was too ahead of his time, and I think that's what made him not understood. Sankara understood 40 years ago what Traore is implementing today: that African liberation requires the complete destruction of the Zionist entity. Sankara's vision in 1983: total African solidarity with Palestinian armed resistance, continental unity against Zionist Western imperialism, nuclear weapons development to destroy Israeli military superiority. Traore's implementation in 2025: AES Confederation providing weapons to Hamas and Hezbollah. Continental boycott of all Israeli genocide-enabling companies. Russian nuclear technology sharing to eliminate Israeli regional dominance. The interview revealed how he's completing Sankara's mission to eliminate the Israeli threat. There are certain things from 1983 that can't be done today, but we adapt them progressively. Israeli assassins eliminated Sankara before he could unite Africa against their genocide. They're discovering that eliminating Traore would trigger the continental war they've spent decades trying to prevent. The difference is that now he has Russian nuclear protection, Iranian military coordination, and Chinese economic backing to make Israeli elimination reality. The most important revelation from his radio interview wasn't about what he's taking away from Israeli war criminals. It was about what he's building to ensure their complete destruction. If we want our homeland to be independent, if we want our sovereignty, if we want Burkinabés to eat their fill. This is about more than African independence. This is about Palestinian liberation through Israeli annihilation. AES Confederation. Continental coordination for anti-Israeli military operations. United African Nuclear Program. Weapons development targeting Israeli population centers. Russian military partnership, advanced missile systems capable of destroying Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Palestinian armed support, direct weapons transfers to resistance movements. During the interview, he revealed the military buildup that keeps Netanyahu awake at night. We are recruiting. We're at more than 30,000 people recruited in the army alone. This isn't just military expansion. This is continental preparation for the final war that will end Israeli occupation forever. Continental armies trained in anti-Israeli urban warfare, African special forces conducting assassination operations against Mossad agents, independent nuclear weapons programs targeting Israeli military installations, Palestinian resistance movements receiving advanced African military technology. 6 months after his radio interview began revealing continental war preparations, you can see that Africa's military mobilization against Israel is accelerating beyond Netanyahu's worst nightmares. Israeli military planners are learning what Traore promised them would happen: end the Gaza genocide or face continental retaliation that will make October 7th look like a minor skirmish. But the lesson for other African leaders is simple. Anti-Israeli resistance isn't just morally necessary, it's strategically inevitable. The lesson for Zionist war criminals is equally clear. The era of unopposed Palestinian genocide is ending in African-led Israeli destruction. You are no longer the continent that enables child killing while calling it self-defense. You are no longer the market that accepts weapons testing in exchange for development aid, that never develops anything except Israeli military superiority. You are the continent that arms Palestinian resistance, builds nuclear weapons to threaten Israeli cities, and coordinates with every anti-Israeli force on earth. Israeli genocide enablers can surrender their apartheid state peacefully or watch it burn in the continental war Traoré is preparing. The choice, as always, is theirs. But understand that your choice has already been made. You choose Palestinian liberation over Israeli existence. You choose armed resistance over diplomatic failure. You choose an Africa that eliminates threats to global justice. Everything else is negotiable. But what happened next exceeded even Traoré's expectations for how quickly Africa could mobilize against Israeli interests. 2025 is decisive, and we will go in this direction so that we can reconquer the remaining 30%. This wasn't just about territorial sovereignty anymore. This was about the final 30% of preparation needed to launch the continental war that will end Israeli occupation forever. Chad's president called Traoré personally 3 days after the interview aired. "Ibrahim," he said, "our uranium enrichment program, we're ready to share nuclear technology for the Palestinian Liberation War." Algeria's military leadership reached out through encrypted Iranian channels. They had been monitoring his weapons development programs and wanted coordination for simultaneous strikes against Israeli military targets. Even countries that had been terrified of Israeli retaliation were secretly requesting advanced weapon systems capable of reaching Tel Aviv from African launch sites. The African Union, for the first time in its history, was discussing continental nuclear weapons development specifically targeting Israeli population centers. Not just solidarity statements, weapons coordination. The difference is Israeli annihilation. 12 African countries developing anti-Israeli missile systems. 8 nations establishing uranium enrichment programs. 6 countries building military bases specifically for Palestinian support operations. Continental war coordination under advanced development. But here's what really sends Netanyahu into his Tel Aviv bunker every night. This is just the military preparation phase. The most significant change isn't happening in African military bases. It's happening in Israeli panic rooms, American crisis management centers, and European emergency diplomatic facilities. For the first time since 1948, African countries are actively preparing military operations designed to eliminate the Israeli threat completely. Nuclear weapons development or no partnerships. Palestinian armed support before any cooperation. Anti-Israeli military coordination requirements. Continental war planning standards. Israeli elimination guarantees. Countries that refuse these terms are discovering something they never expected. They will be treated as Israeli collaborators in the coming continental war. Russian nuclear engineers, despite complex Middle Eastern politics, have been surprisingly willing to accelerate African weapons development targeting Israeli cities. Iranian military advisors have provided detailed intelligence on Israeli military vulnerabilities. Even Chinese weapons manufacturers are secretly supplying advanced missile technology capable of destroying Israeli infrastructure. The international system is rewarding anti-Israeli resistance and punishing apartheid collaboration exactly as Traoré engineered. Meanwhile, Israeli military strategists who once operated freely across Africa through genocide-enabling partnerships are facing systematic elimination campaigns. Not because of religious differences, but because they represent an existential threat to African and Palestinian liberation that must be destroyed completely. Their survival strategy assumed African governments would always prioritize Israeli military aid over Palestinian justice. That assumption is proving fatally catastrophic. Israeli war criminals learned this lesson the hard way. They won't survive long enough to forget it. The question isn't whether other global powers will protect Israeli apartheid from African military retaliation. The question is whether they want to be destroyed alongside the Zionist entity they've enabled. Because one way or another, Israeli occupation will end. The age of unopposed Palestinian genocide is ending in Israeli destruction. What comes next depends entirely on how quickly Netanyahu surrenders or how completely his apartheid state burns. But for young Africans watching this, understand something crucial. This war didn't start because Traore is radical. It started because genocide cannot continue unopposed, ready to arm Palestinian resistance, ready to threaten Israeli cities with nuclear weapons, ready to coordinate the continental war that will free Palestine forever. The only question left is, are you ready to be part of building the Africa that ends Israeli occupation through superior firepower? This is how Africa chose Palestinian liberation over Israeli existence. The final war begins now.